Welcome to our talk on the distribution and habitat of endangered slave and skink on Dano Island, Guam. It may interest you to know that there's only 4 species of endangered lizards. The blunt-nosed leopard lizard in California, the St. Croix ground lizard in the US Virgin Islands, the Culebra Island giant anole in Puerto Rico that hasn't been seen for many years and is probably extinct, and the star of our show, slave and skink. Slave and skink is endemic to the Marianas Islands. It's found nowhere else on Earth. Historically, it was known from the larger southern islands, Tinian, Rota, Guam, but also Dano Island, and it's the specimens from these islands that were used to describe the species in the early 1970s. By the 40s, Slavoni was apparently extinct on Tinia, Rota, and Guam for reasons that are unknown. Since then, it's been found on Asuncion Island, Pagan Island, Almagan, and Sarigan. In the early 90s, Slavoni apparently disappeared from Dano Island, and people thought it was extinct there. It was rediscovered there in 2012, apparently after the eradication of rats on the island by USDA. And here's our study area, Dano Island. It's a nicely vegetated island. We had a number of objectives. The first was just simply to delineate the geographic extent of Slavoni on Cocos Island. Where was it found and where is it not found? Second was to identify the vegetation classifications where it occurs, identify substrate types that it used, or if you will, perch types. Perch types are important because lizards use them to survey their domain for mates, to look for insect food to eat, but probably most importantly, they use them as a place where they know they can escape from, down into the places where they can hide from predators. And last, to assess the abundance of another native Moya, the Pacific blue-tailed skink, and the invasive Carlia skink. And we did this in what we thought was core Slavoni habitat. Another set of objectives was to assess the extent to which the core distribution of Pacific blue-tailed skink approximates the core distribution of Slavoni. That is can it be used as sort of a habitat proxy for Slavoni? And the way we did that is we compared point counts for each species within different vegetation classifications to counts that would be expected under complete spatial randomness. And I'll touch on that a little bit. And then secondly, as just another measure, we used hotspot analysis to identify statistically significant spatial clusters of high values or hotspots and low values. And we did that for both species. And then we looked at the extent to which they spatially overlapped. And lastly, during the course of our work, we noticed that Slavoni seemed to be associated with palm trees and all the debris that they produce. So again, we used hotspot analysis to identify hotspots for palms, and then as well as both lizard species. And then again, we looked to see the extent of spatial overlap between the lizard hotspots and the palm hotspots. So this is how we surveyed the island, just by walking meandering transects with a handheld GPS, GPSing all the Pacific blue-tailed skinks and Slavoni that we saw. You can see here, just for your reference, is the government boundary as far as we know. We also had to categorize these big patches of Columbina asiatic that weren't captured in the vegetation classifications. We couldn't walk through these. We didn't survey on the resort grounds, and nor did we survey any other places, like on the leeward side here, where Slavoni was obviously not going to be, just because it's too open and sunny. After the survey, this is what we found for Slaveneye, 12 individuals after walking the entire island. In contrast to that, 295 Pacific blue-tailed skinks. Getting back to these, what we did with these then is we looked at the type of forest habitat these 12 individuals were in, and then we searched every bit of the same habitat to the fullest extent where it occurred anywhere over the entire island. And that took a number of months because these animals are so, it takes so long to find them. So this is what we got. Pretty much the same distribution, but note here we have 199 observations on Amoy Slaveneye now. Just some estimates on the area that they occupy. The most permissive would be the putting a convex hull around these points, which gives you, has them occupying about 11% of the total area of Dano, and a much more restrictive concave hull gives you about 5.4% of the entire island. So for vegetation classifications, we use this source here, and we got the GIS layers from here. This is what it looks like when imposed on Cocos Island. I'd like you to just take note of a very small area of actual what's classified as coconut forest. That means there's really a lot of coconuts right in these two little areas right here. The other type of forest to look at here is the mixed introduced forest here, this light green here, over here. And again, here's our Columbina thickets that somebody really needs to get rid of. It's a native plant, but it's pretty invasive on Cocos. So superimposing the all the Slaveneye point locations onto here, what we did then is we took these points and we extracted them by the vegetation polygon that they occurred in, and then we corrected all these points based on the total area of these polygons for each of these classifications. And then to make this data a little bit more easier to look at, we simply used a relative count index here, where positive values mean that the number of points that we found in a particular land category were overrepresented. A negative value indicates that the number of Slaveneye that we found in that vegetation classification was underrepresented. So here's a nice piece of data here displayed that way. As you can see, Slaveneye was overrepresented in coconut forest, and I'll remind you again that was a very small bit of coconut forest that exists on Dano. And secondly, by mixed forests, and they're underrepresented in these other three classifications. And just by the way, all the differences between these things are statistically significant. Perch types. It's interesting that when we first come upon a Slaveneye in the field, they were almost always sitting on a palm frond or a coconut, that is parts of coconuts, and a lesser extent to dead wood, that's sort of horizontal dead wood that's fallen to the forest floor, coral rubble, which occurs on the interior of the island in very small quantities here and there, bare ground, of course, which is of course ubiquitous, and tree trunks where they sometimes occur a few feet up on the side of a tree trunk as a perch. But the main thing to recognize here is that we didn't quantify everything that was out there. Say we didn't get an assessment of how many coconuts there are out there versus how many they are using. So we can't say that these are our preferences. This is just what we observe them doing. But still, it's interesting that they're using palm fronds and coconuts for perches. And just some examples of that. Here's what happens under a palm tree that's been building up debris for many years. You get all this deposition of palm frond, rotting palm fronds and coconuts that are building up, providing nice little piles where these guys sit, and they can escape out of this stuff down into these piles very rapidly. Where these animals were found in 2000 or rediscovered was this road that the resort uses or has been using for many decades to dump all their green waste along both sides of the road. So here's one side of the road with some green waste. And you can see some coconuts here that are germinating. But this has also provided optimal, what appears to be optimal habitat for these guys with just all this stuff that they can hide under. And last, this uncommon type of refugia that they are also found in is the coral rubble. Again, you notice how big it is. They perch on this stuff. They can jump off it and be down in a crack in a second. There's an interesting congruence between the physical shape of this coral rubble and coconuts that I'd like to point out. Relative abundances, what we did here is we went into what we thought again was core Slaveni habitat. We set up 4 transects and we walked those transects on 2 different dates, counting all the different individuals of these 3 species that we saw. Carlia, of course, the introduced species, was the by far the most common. You could see 3 to 4 of those a minute. Pacific bluetails, you can see 1 to 2 of those a minute, and Slaveni, very few a minute. So just to get back to objective 2, to assess the extent to which core distributions of Pacific bluetails approximate the core distributions of Slaveni, and this is, of course, what we did again. So here again is our the first bit of data I showed you for Amoya slaveni. Here's the same sort of data processed in the same way as before for the Pacific bluetail. And note it's extremely similar. They're overrepresented again, and that's those small patches of coconut forest. Secondly, mixed forest, and some of these other categories that they're underrepresented in are the same as well. And again, most of these differences between these are statistically significant. So getting on to hotspot analyses, here is the Pacific bluetail location data after having a hotspot analysis run on it. 2 little spots here, some cold spots where you would expected there to be individuals, but there's nothing. By the way, this is mostly Casuarina forest out here, which is not good for, really not good for lizards at all or anything else as far as I can tell. Hotspot for Amoya slaveni. No cold spots because the data is not really spread out. It's not going to yield that kind of thing. But a big hotspot right here. Here's where they overlap. The green is the 99% confidence hotspot for slaveni, superimposed over that for Pacific bluetail. Notice that it fits right within that for Pacific bluetails. Objective 3, we wanted to examine the potential space association of slaveni and cocos palms, because as I said, we were noticing that they were kind of associated with them. And again, we just used the same kind of hotspot analysis to do that. We took this imagery of Cocos Island and we digitized the locations of all the palms that were visible on here. Ran a hotspot on that. And here's our familiar bilobed hotspot here. Here, if we look at the intersection of the Pacific bluetail hotspot with that of the palm spot, it's nicely nestled within that for the palm. Same thing for slaveni, nestled right nicely within the hotspot for palms. So in summary, Amoya slaveni occurs in a small area forest and where it's the most uncommon skink species. It's overrepresented in coconut and mixed introduced forest. underrepresented in the other types. Fallen palm debris seems to be the primary perch sites, again, that they use for escape primarily. The pattern of overrepresentation, underrepresentation by vegetation types is similar for Slaveni and Pacific bluetails, and their hotspots are largely coincident with that of the palms. So management considerations, pretty simple. Get more palms equals more Slaveni. Palms are easy to plant. They don't even have to be planted. They can be laid out and they'll germinate and pretty much do fine on their own. So thank you. And we'd like to thank the staff at the Cocos Island Resort for letting us roam their land and providing a pretty reasonable accommodations to get over there.